Hi, this is Kurt. It's been a while since I posted a video, but I'm helping to facilitate a ongoing study discussion group on A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita as it is, and we're about to enter into the first chapter after having gone through the introduction. Um, and we're unable to meet this week because of schedule conflicts and illness and so forth. So I was thinking that I probably should take a bit of time to talk about the Mahabharata and some of the incidences leading up to the Battle of Kurukshetra and the Bhagavad Gita to give folks some context as to what's going to take place on the battlefield and why, in the first chapter of Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna is so dejected, and why he, in essence, refuses to fight. And this, of course, initiates the whole discussion between Arjuna and Krishna about the nature of the soul and the nature of reality and Krishna's identity, Arjuna's identity, and ultimately why he should fight and why he does ultimately choose to fight. So I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the Mahabharata and some of the incidences therein that have a bearing on the Bhagavad Gita. I will give a caveat that I'm not an expert on the Mahabharata. I have I've studied several. I have several summary studies, if you will, of the Mahabharata. One of the more comprehensive ones and readable ones is Krishna Dharma, the Mahabharata retold by Krishna Dharma. That is available online for free at www.vedabase.com, along with his version of the Ramayana as well. They're also both available on Audible for folks that like audiobooks. Those are not free, but you can get them with your monthly Audible credits. And it's highly accessible, although the language is a bit florid. But there are many versions out there. I probably have about four of them. There's a new comprehensive total translation of it that's out. That's 10 volumes. I don't have that one as of yet because it's minimally like $100. But anyway, the point being is that I have a working knowledge of the Mahabharata, but I'm not an expert. If you want something with some insight into the primary stories, Hridayananda Das Goswami has a book. I believe I can't remember the title, but it was recently released. If you just look up Hridayananda Das Goswami or Dr. Howard J. Resnick, eventually you'll make it to his website. I believe it's HD Goswami at .org or something to that effect. But you can purchase the book there, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's not available on Amazon as well. But I recommend anything written by him or endorsed by him for a bit more depth and consideration and scholarly as well as spiritual insight. But I can essentially give an overview for beginners and essentially everybody in our Bhagavad Gita study to one degree or other is a beginner on this path of Vaishnavism, Gaudiya Vaishnavism, Bhakti Yoga, um, what have you. So, uh, the Mahabharata, the term Mahabharata, of course, means great India or greater India. The connotation is that it's in reference to a world culture, that there is India proper, but also that culture extended um, throughout the world. And there's a degree of archaeological evidence that suggests that this indeed may have been the case, and of course that evidence is disputable, but there it is out there. And if we look at the um, mythological frameworks of a lot of ancient cultures, there are a lot of corollaries with the Vedic deities and so forth, and that had to come from somewhere, whether it was through trade, through in the Jungian sense, like a collective unconscious, or that in fact at one point there was a world culture. Um, and then over time, just as the case with language, um, um, it's kind of developed on its own. Different cultures developed on their own, apart from this world culture. Because getting ahead of myself, but after the Battle of Kurukshetra, and because of some of the events that take place during the 18 Days War that follow the Bhagavad Gita, the notion of a world culture was shattered. It was some of the weapons that were discharged, for instance, completely altered the nature of consciousness in some cases. Um, there is, in fact, and there have been a number of studies on this, evidence, for instance, that there are remains at Kurukshetra, the historical place, Kurukshetra, that indicate that there was something to the effect of a nuclear detonation or multiple nuclear detonations there, and no one can explain that historically except through the narration given in the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata speaks essentially of nuclear weapons or something equivalent, as well as sentient trans-dimensional space vehicles and so on and so forth. So you can see that a number of ancient astronaut theorists and so forth kind of gravitate to the Mahabharata in some ways, and also some infamous folks throughout history have done so, like the Nazis, for instance, trying to figure out exactly how to make a Vimana, which is the spacecraft, and so on and so forth, or one type of the spacecraft. But in any case, I don't hold to the notion that human beings were created to mine gold for the Anunnaki and so on and so forth. I'm not going to no deference to Zechariah Sitchin, but I'm not, I don't buy into that. And scholars, actual scholars of the Mahabharata, don't buy into that either. On the first season of Ancient Aliens, for instance, Michael Cremo was quoted quite a bit, and they interviewed him and so on and so forth. But he did not appear on subsequent seasons, and I bet that was by his design, by his choice, because some of actually quite a bit of it just kind of went off the rails. But anyway, so the Mahabharata, right, can really be seen as the story of a family, the Kuru dynasty, and more so, and more specifically, it's the story of the five Pandava brothers, or sons of Pandu. Before the Pandavas, though, it's the story of Bhishma, and for those familiar with, in fact, in the first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, one of the first scenes that we get is Bhishma blowing his conch shell, and this is a show of power, right, and intimidation. It's very much like a rabbi, blowing a shofar. A shofar, if you're familiar with the horn that the rabbi will blow, the ram's horn. It's to show that it's an announcement, right, that this powerful person is on the scene, and of course Krishna blows his, and Arjuna blows his as well, and of course in the temple, if those of you familiar with Vaishnava temples, during an arti, there will the conch, or to announce the deities, the conch will be blown, and that's to break the silence, right? To let people know, hey, the deities are awake, the deities are present. Be aware, that you're in the presence of the supreme, right? Supreme persons, okay, in the form of the deities on the altar. Of course, that takes a modicum of faith, but that's the idea. But who's Bhishma? Who's Bhishma Dev, right? So the Mahabharata really begins with King Shantanu, Bhishma's father, and he falls in love. There's lots of love, lots of romance, and lots of betrayal in the Mahabharata. So people really gravitate to this, right? And that's the idea, is that they gravitate to the story, the history. The Mahabharata's in a class of texts called the Itihasas, which are supplementary to the Vedas. And so the idea was, well, we can convey, or Veda Vyas could convey the moral codes and so forth, and given in the Vedas in these histories, in such a way that the people who would gravitate towards these stories would essentially learn via the stories how to live right, how to live well, and how to live piously, and so forth. And so and of course, the Bhagavad Gita is basically at the conclusion of the Mahabharata, more or less, and it is the soul, right? It is the soul, the crux of Vedic wisdom, and so by the time if one were to read or listen to the Mahabharata, because of course it was recited, professional reciters would go from town to town and so forth and recite stories, from the Mahabharata. But if one sort of grew up steeped in these stories, and people still are, right? If you come from a Vaishnava tradition, if you come from actually any tradition in India, you grow up with these stories from birth, basically. And so by the time someone gets to the Gita, one is very much attached to these characters. And so Bhishma is the first of the principal character that really becomes introduced. But his father, right, Maharaj Shantanu, he falls in love with Mother Ganga, right, the Devi of personification of the Ganga River, or the Ganges River. So in Vedic understanding, you have devas and devis, or shining ones, right? These are not divine beings in the sense of immortal beings, or perfect beings, so to speak, or supreme beings. These are divine beings in the sense of being incredibly empowered in comparison to human beings, extremely long-lived, very, very powerful, and in comparison to human, they may seem immortal, but they are actually not. But anyway, they Mother Ganga tries to dissuade Shantanu because obviously a human, even a very powerful human, even a human whose lifespan may be 1,000 years at the time of the Mahabharata, because it's a different age. But that's a whole other subject. But yeah, the idea is that prior to the Battle of Kurukshetra, people lived much longer and were much more intelligent, and so on and so forth. And so even so, she tries to dissuade him, but he's extremely persistent, and so she finally says, "Well, okay, I will marry you, but when we have children, you cannot question what I do with the children. The moment that you question what I do upon the birth of children is the moment that I will depart, that I will leave." And so, of course, because he's in love, and let's face it, he's a dude, right? He's a guy. He says, "Oh yeah, sure, great." So they get married. She becomes queen, and they begin to have children. Well, the first child is born. She takes the child upon birth, takes the child out and drowns the child in the Ganga, in the river that is her namesake, right? So Shantanu is outraged by this, as any person would be, right? But doesn't say anything because he promised that he wouldn't. So this happens several more times over years, right? Over seasons and years, and then finally he just can't take it anymore, right? So he confronts her upon trying to drown a child, and she tells him, she's like, well, "You don't understand." She's like, basically, "You stupid human, you don't understand. These children were very, very advanced souls, extremely advanced souls, who had to, for various karmic reasons, take birth, and by drowning them, I was releasing them to the spiritual world." Right, returning them to the spiritual world, essentially, helping them out. That this was kind of a last stepping stone, or a last hurrah, if you will, or stop off place. It was that layover interlude, right, to go into the spiritual world. But they needed my help to do this, right? But so the one she wasn't able to complete drowning the son. So she says, well, she names him Devavrata, right? She names the son Devavrata and takes the son away. So Shantanu, of course, is like, well, I screwed up, I really messed up, whatever. So, but he's left alone, and he carries on as king, and so on. Well, long about the time that Devavrata's, teenager-ish. Again, I'm not an expert on the text. I just know the broad strokes. Ganga brings him back to his father and says, "Okay, well, he's a teenager now. He's heir to the throne of Hastinapur. Incidentally, Hastinapur means city of the elephants, right? It's a big, roughly located, present day, I believe, New Delhi, that area. But anyway, he needs his father, right? He needs to know how to be a king, because that's his dharma, that's his responsibility, being born the son of a king. So you need to show him, right? So she leaves the son with the father. Well, turns out Devavrata has learned all these celestial weapons and fighting techniques and so on and so forth, being with his mother in the realm of the Devas, or the Shining Ones, right? So his knowledge of everything sort of far outweighs that of humans, and he's just great, and he respects his father, loves his father. Everything's really great. Well, his father, we know that his father likes the ladies, right? We've already established this. Well, so Shantanu happens to see this very, very beautiful woman, young woman, in a fishing village. I believe her name was Satyavati, and she is incredibly beautiful. So of course he wants to marry her because he's the king, and hey, king, most beautiful woman, why not? Well, her father, although he's not a noble, he's not a royal, right? He's not a kshatriya or warrior caste. He's shrewd, right? And he says, wait a minute. He's like, my daughter's children would not be king because your son Devavrata is the heir to the throne, right? And why wouldn't he be? He's amazing, right? He's essentially a demigod himself, right? He's half god, right? He's half Deva. So why wouldn't he be? Why wouldn't he be the king? So she said, the only way that you're going to marry my daughter is if her children can rule, right? So out of respect and love for his father, Devavrata makes a vow that he will never marry, and that not only will he never marry, but he'll also remain celibate. So there's no chance of him producing an heir, legitimate or otherwise. So at this point, his father is so moved by this, and in fact, the text describes that not only is Shantanu moved, but all the celestials, right? All the devas are incredibly moved by this, and his father tells him that from this point on, you're going to be known as Bhishma. Right, you're going to be known as Bhishma. Bhishma essentially, if I remember correctly, means grave or sorrowful, right? And not only that, but you can pick when and how you die. So this is going to factor in this is going to be very important in the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, because Bhishma Dev actually is one of the few people, even though he fights on the opposite side of Krishna in the Mahabharata war, because his responsibility he understands to be with the kingdom of Hastinapur, and the Pandavas are technically warring against the kingdom of Hastinapur, even though Yudhishthira is the rightful king. Bhishma Dev is on the opposite side, but that being said, he's one of the few who understands entirely and completely who Krishna is. That Krishna, in Prabhupada's words, the supreme is Bhagavan, or the supreme personality of Godhead. And so, in the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, well, actually, in Mahabharata, in the war itself, Krishna actually breaks a vow. He had vowed that he himself would not enter into the fight, right? He's acting as Arjuna's charioteer, but he himself is not fighting. Because if he were to fight himself, it would be over immediately, because everybody knew nobody's going to defeat Krishna, right? Nobody's going to defeat Krishna. If it was a one-on-one, right? Or 1,000 on one or whatever, Krishna would still come out victorious, because he had this reputation for killing so many demons, for doing all that. I mean, a lot of people argued over who Krishna was and what was the source of his power and so on and so forth, but nobody argued over what he did, right? Because there's evidence of that. So anyway, Krishna himself vowed that he wasn't going to fight. But he actually enters into the war and kills Bhishma Dev, because anyone killed by Krishna, right? He uses a chariot wheel and crushes him with it. Anyone killed by Krishna immediately goes back to the spiritual world and eternally resides with Krishna, right, in bliss, right? And Bhishma Dev knew this, right? And so that's how he chose to die. It's how he wanted to die, and Krishna knew that. And the lesson here, of course, is that Krishna will do anything and everything to fulfill the desires of his pure devotees, right? Of his pure devotees. And so even if that means essentially breaking the law, right? Love transcends law, right? That's essentially the message here, that love, true love, pure love, transcends the letter of the law and so on, right? Getting ahead of myself again. So anyway, Bhishma, is now celibate and so on and so forth, and he's not gonna be, and he renounces the throne. He's not gonna be, but he's given this boon, right? So Satyavati and Shantanu, they have two sons. They die in quick succession. Well, Shantanu dies. They have two sons. They die essentially in quick succession. They, but what happens at that point is that they essentially, Mother Satyavati says that she actually has another son, right? She has another son. That years before, there was this great sage who was traveling, in her boat across the lake, in her little fishing village and everything, and he says, you're exceptionally beautiful and so on. I actually have the power to make love to you, and you can retain your virginity. So, can we do? And essentially, he creates this mist, and they do what they do, and the result was the sage Vyasa, right? So she summons him, and he says, I would gladly help you. I would gladly help you do this. I will gladly, father children on the part of these widows in the name of your dead son, your deceased son, to propagate the kingdom. But I was in the midst of meditation. I am incredibly dirty, so on and so forth. Let me come back at a later date and we'll take care of this. We'll get this done. And she says, no, it has to be done now, right? Very, very impatient, right? So it has to be done now. Okay. So he goes into the first widow, the first widow's chambers. She sees him and closes her eyes, right? As a result, Vedavyas says that the child born will be then born blind. Okay, so they actually go in and they warn the second one. So she keeps her eyes open, but she turns pale with fright. So she says that son will be born pale. Okay. And pale and not in the best health. But so in any case, we have what basically, and then he actually also impregnates a maidservant as well, and the maidservant doesn't react negatively to him at all. But in essence, there's two princes, born, right? One is Dhritarashtra. He's incredibly physically powerful. He's brilliant, and so on. The problem is he's blind, and according to the Vedic codes and so on, a blind person cannot be, blind man cannot be the king. So the other son, Pandu, who is born pale, right? He's actually the king. He's actually the crown prince and so on. And well, basically, what happens is, Pandu grows up. He's very qualified to be king. Goes on and does lots of kingly stuff and everything, and he ends up marrying Krishna's aunt, or the person who would become Krishna's aunt, Kunti. And if you're familiar with the Srimad Bhagavatam, you're aware of the prayers of Queen Kunti, where she actually recounts a lot of the troubles that she and her sons go through, and actually thanks Krishna for those troubles because it allowed her to rely on Krishna. That this is incredibly elevated, right? Most of us, myself included, would not be like, hey, Krishna, give me a bunch of trouble so I can learn to rely on you, right? It's not where I am. It's not where a lot of us would be. But Queen Kunti is an incredibly, incredibly elevated soul, and that's her desire and her position. But anyway, she marries Pandu. Pandu also marries a slightly younger, incredibly beautiful queen named Madri. Dhritarashtra marries a queen called Gandhari. And Gandhari, famously, when she finds out that she is going to be married to a blind king, she actually puts a veil over her eyes, ties a blindfold around her eyes, and that is and she's very much revered by a lot of people for that. To me, and again, I'm not an expert here, but to me that's mode of passion to me, because I mean, some of you, if you're just a casual YouTube viewer or whatever, you don't know I'm in a wheelchair. I don't expect my significant other to duct tape her legs together and sit in a wheelchair because I'm in a wheelchair. That makes no sense to me. But Gandhari, blindfolds herself and lives her life as a blind person. Well, long story short, Dhritarashtra and Gandhari, they have 100 sons and one daughter, but it's not in a typical fashion, right? Gandhari actually gives birth to this giant after a long, incredibly long period of gestation, right? Gives birth to this giant mass. We would possibly, from our point of reference, we might think of it as like a giant tumor type thing or something like that. But sages tell them to parcel out this mass into 100 jars, and they do that, and ultimately in these jars, fetuses develop, and they develop into sons. The oldest of which is Duryodhana, and another one is Dusasan, and there are a couple others that are mentioned by name. But they become very powerful, and Duryodhana ultimately is he's a spoiled. He's incredibly entitled, right? He's the son of Dhritarashtra. Okay, so he feels incredibly entitled and such. And incidentally, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. That you're like, well, Dhritarashtra's not supposed to be king. Well, that's true. What happens is that Pandu is hunting. We know, if you know anything about the Vedic literature, when Kshatriyas or warriors go out hunting, typically something goes amiss, right? And that's what happens in Pandu's case, right? He's going out hunting, and he happens upon a deer who's making love to a female deer. They're in the midst of doing their thing. He goes and he kills the deers. Well, problem is they were not deer, right? They were sages. It was a sage and his wife in the form of deer, making love, essentially in deer form, so that the wife wouldn't feel embarrassed about somebody potentially seeing her. They could still enjoy themselves in the open and be in nature and stuff, and but nobody would like sort of oogle over her, right? And disrespect her in that way if they were in deer form. So, but Pandu kills them, and so the sage curses Pandu and says, the next time that you embrace either one of your wives sexually or with sexual desire, you're gonna die, right? So Pandu then says, "Well, I'm gonna become an ascetic, right? I'm just gonna go in the forest, right?" And this is sort of parallel to Ram being in the Ramayana. He's forced into the forest for 14 years. Well, Pandu also is like, "Well, I'm I've got to go in the forest." So Kunti, and Madri, they go in the forest. And around this time is when Dhritarashtra and Gandhari, when they have Lajars and so on. And ultimately Duryodhana and his brothers are born out of that, right? So Dhritarashtra is sitting on the throne in the place of Pandu. Um, and so, for all intents and purposes, Dhritarashtra is functioning as the king, even though, according to custom, he shouldn't be the king. And Duryodhana grows up as the heir apparent, and he's incredibly entitled and incredibly self-centered, and so on. So, as this is occurring, Pandu um, Pandu says, I can possibly, I can handle not having sex. It's a real big drag, right? Because I'm married to these beautiful women, right? But I'm a king. I've got to have sons, but I've got to have children. How are we going to do this, right? How is this? So Kunti actually reveals to him that she had been given a special mantra um, as a gift, as a boon from sages, such that she could call any celestial, any deva that she wanted to give her a child. And she knew that it worked because she'd actually done it once before. Um, when she was given the mantra, she decided, hey, she's young. She's like, I'm gonna test this out. So she calls Surya, right? She calls the sun god, and he gives her his son, who's born with coated in golden armor, and so on. But of course, she's unmarried. She's scared out of her mind. She puts the son in a basket and sends him along the river. Of course, we get number one. We get two things out of this, right? We get two tropes out of this, right? For those of you who are familiar with ancient literature and so forth, right? We get the child in the basket, which we see with Moses, right? Although Moses is found by Pharaoh's daughter Karna, who's the child in the basket here, he's found by a charioteer, which is not a noble, right? So he's raised as a charioteer's son. But we also get the idea of virgin birth, right? We got that with Veda Vyasa's birth as well. But in any case, she uses this mantra 3 times to produce Yudhishthir, the son of Dharma, or the law, right? And this is very appropriate because Yudhishthir's first child, he's essentially the heir. He's essentially the king, right? He's the son of Dharma, right? So he's empowered with all of from birth, essentially, with wisdom. Uh, and then you have Arjuna, who is the son of Indra. Indra being essentially the king of the gods, the Zeus figure, right? Um, and then you have Bhima, who is the son of the wind god. And he's incredibly strong. In fact, his also son of a wind god. The wind god is Hanuman, and there's actually an encounter between Bhima and Hanuman in the Mahabharata at one point. But anyway, and then you have, but then. And she says, and Pandu, wants more sons, right? But Kunti doesn't want to use the mantras again, so she allows Madri to use the mantras, and she has two sons, Nakula and Sahadev, and so there are 5 Pandava brothers, and they begin their lives, being raised by their parents in the forest. Well, at one point, Pandu, he gets, he has desire, right, for Madri, and embraces her, and dies. Okay, so basically what happens is that Madri goes on to, a fire, right, a funeral pyre, and goes to the celestial realm with her husband. And Kunti is left to raise the boys. I'm going to end right here. Because nature calls. I will be back.